himself in all of the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, and he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is nearly over." So he went to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Famous words, aren't they? Then, and only then, were their eyes opened, and they recognized him. And then he was gone. And they took off, he vanished. I don't know, I don't get that part, but They said to each other, "Wow, were not our hearts burning within us when he was talking to us on the road?" Well, he was opening the scriptures to us. Man, your heart burns when you get a little sight of understanding, That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has indeed risen, and he has appeared to Simon." And then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread, and resurrection happens. Well, brothers and sisters, I began last week by sharing with you out of the a text in Matthew where Jesus says to the religious leaders, "Look, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. 3 days in the earth, 3 days in the belly, 3 days in the dark. It's all the same thing." And I, in my own way, try to poetically give you some words that I think are true about the idea, the spiritual reality of resurrection. And very quickly, I said resurrection, number one, is a point in time historical experience. But it's not something that only happened once in history. I said, secondly, resurrection is a process or a pattern. And that's why Jesus says that the path of descent is the sign that leads to ascension. What happened to Jonah must happen to me, and what happened to me must happen to you. That is the spiritual path, the way, as the early movement was called. So resurrection only follows the path of descent. It is a pattern. It's not one that we welcome. I certainly did not and do not. And it is not only a once in a lifetime experience. The third thing I said about resurrection is participation. And what I meant by that is participation in the presence of the mystery of the presence of the Spirit now. Christ descended, but he said, I leave, but I send you the Spirit. So to celebrate resurrection is to practice the presence of the Spirit of the risen one now. Not gather once a year and put lilies in the sanctuary and say, "He is risen indeed. Indeed, he is risen," or whatever the phrase is. As though it happened only at a point of time. No, it is a process and a pattern, and it is a participation with the presence of the Spirit. And one of the things that I said that I firmly believe is that the idea of separation is not true. Where can I go to flee from your Spirit? If I make my bed in the heavens, or if I go to the depths in Sheol, if I live in the belly of the earth or in the belly of a fish, if I make my bed on the other side of the world, if I go into hiding, if I'm somewhere, can I find separation from you? And the psalmist says, go where you will, but you cannot find separation. Religion, listen to me. I don't know how else to say it more clearly. Religion is about the idea of separation. That you are separated from God because of something you've done, or because of something you haven't done, or because of something some other people did a long time ago. And therefore, you are separated from God. And the only thing that you can do, you're over here and God's over here, is that something has to transactionally happen so that you can be united again to God. That's religion. And different religions will tell you what you have to do. Resurrection is the proclamation of presence and no separation. And it is the proclamation. And you remember the famous passage out of Revelation that I read last week. I am the eternal and I am the risen one. And I hold the keys. I hold the keys to life and death. So resurrection for us who follow Jesus is a proclamation of hope, even in the face of death. So this morning, I want to add just a couple ideas out of this narrative, out of the Road to Emmaus story. Number one is that it says that they were on this journey to a little village or a town 7 miles from Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting, make of it what you will, but there is no historic reference to a town called Emmaus, and no theologian or historian can tell you anything about Emmaus. There is one reference to an area with a similar type of name, which was much further to the north, that was a part of the Maccabean revolt. It was an area where those that fought for freedom that was kind of their base. But as somebody who reads scripture the way that I read scripture and why I call it poetry, I have a tendency to believe that the idea of 7 miles is symbolic, that it was something to have to, 7 is one of those repeated concepts in scripture of fullness. And I think these guys are on a significant journey. Okay. And so that's the way I read it. I'll let you read it as you will, but I just wanted to point out that for you Bible geeks. Now, in the story, obviously, they're walking along, 2 of them, and Jesus comes up alongside them and enters into conversation with them, and they don't recognize him. And I want to ask you a question this morning. Why did he enter into conversation with them? And I'm going to propose one answer. It's not the only answer, but it's the answer that we need right now. As people in Minnesota, as people in the Twin Cities, as people in the United States, this is the answer that we need. Why did Jesus show up in their conversation? Could it be, as I state the question on the board there for you, was it because they were speaking to each other honestly about the fundamental issues of their lives and the pain that they were in? It appears on every reading here that these 2 disciples are like deeply engaged in their pain and in a true conversation. And I wonder if that isn't where Jesus always shows up. It seems to me that many are wanting to, and many are engaged in. And we'll continue here at Calvary to try to provide more opportunities for this, to engage in the fundamental pain, the conversations around the history and the present reality of privilege and racism in our country, and in ourselves. I think he showed up because they were getting real. Think about that. Just in your own relationships and in your own conversations. Like, it's not everything is always going to be some deep, traumatic look at the history of life. But isn't it true that there's something spiritual about a conversation that's real? So just take that with you this morning. Now, one of the pieces of gospel that I find in this story is that Jesus shows up, and it talks about these two disciples. One is Cleopas and one is unnamed. Boy, have you ever heard of Cleopas before in the scriptures? I don't know who Cleopas was. And if you know anything about Luke's gospel, Luke, more than any other gospel, shares stories where kind of the hero or the heroine, whatever term, I don't know, those terms aren't the right terms, but like using human beings as examples, right? In Luke's gospel, he'll tell a narrative about a guy, and then he'll share a story about a woman. So the way I read this is we got Cleopas and we have a woman unnamed. All right. Jesus shows up with somebody who's not mentioned anywhere else, and with some other woman or some other person who's not named, and it's on the day of resurrection. This is the day of resurrection we're talking about. He isn't with the 11, not initially. He's not in Jerusalem showing his hands and his side to Caiaphas or Herod or Pilate or any of the other politicians and powerful people who killed him. He wasn't there saying, "Told you guys." No, he shows up with these two ordinary, common folk like you and me. Do you see the gospel in that? I do. I think it's a fantastic piece of the story. Now, I have another question, however. When they enter into the conversation, they speak about absence because they experienced absence. The disciples, folks, these were folks who were all in, man. And they had spent time with Jesus. And then he's gone. I mean, none of them thought he was going. They never got it. He kept telling them, "I'm going to Jerusalem, and because of who I am and what I've done and what I say and who I hang out with and who I eat with, they're gonna kill me." It's kind of like Dr. King, man. I could see that promised land. I have a sense I'm not going to get there with it, but it's kind of like that, right? But these guys over and over, they just didn't get it. Oh wow, it's 11. And so they experienced his absence, and that absence was very painful. You know that feeling, don't you? My question is this: if the path of descent is a true spiritual principle, if resurrection only follows descent, does absence, a deepening sense of absence, is that necessary before you experience and feel the existential presence of the Spirit of the risen one? Does that make sense? So when you feel God absent, don't turn it in on yourself and say, "God doesn't care about me." That absence is the seed that you spend time with that will produce a deepening awareness of presence. That's what the belly of the fish means. Next slide. Oh, we had hoped. He said, we had hoped. We had hoped things would be different. We'd hoped that last time somebody was killed, that things would be different. We had hoped that the laws would change the outcomes. We had hoped the last protest would be the last protest. We had hoped, we had hoped, we had hoped. Here's a quote out of Job. There's another man in Scripture, another human being who experienced the absence before experiencing a deepening awareness of presence. A man who modeled, unfortunately, where we do not want to go and what we do not want to experience. Deep loss. Where then is my hope? Who can see any hope for me? Will it go down to the gates of Sheol? Will we descend together into the dust? All of us, in different ways and in different experiences, probably have had our hope crushed. As a white man, middle-class guy, fairly educated, still young, I have to listen to the hope that has been crushed over and over and over again by those who don't look like me. It's my job right now. Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher. You guys know me. I'm a philosopher. I like philosophy because philosophy is more about questions and answers, and I'm more about questions and answers. But I love this quote by Kierkegaard. Hope is a passion for the possible. And sometimes when hope is crushed, we become blind to the hope that is what is possible, right? And the church exists, brothers and sisters. I am telling you, it is for a time such as this. We must model what is possible by entering into these deep conversations where the Spirit and the presence of Jesus arrives. I'm telling you, this is the pattern. This is resurrection. This is not just something that happened once. This is the path of descent that leads to ascent. This is spiritual truth, I am saying. That's why Jesus said, was it not necessary? Did you not read the book? Was it not necessary that I suffer? And the question, obviously, is that there are some things that we learn only through suffering. And I did that series in February on the life and teachings of Dr. Howard Thurman. One of the strange things that he said that he experienced when with Gandhi that I thought was fascinating was that he believed that it would be the African Americans' job in the United States to bear witness to how one can be resolved to nonviolence in the midst of having one's hopes crushed over and over again. That it would be the African American who taught the world that lesson. What a challenge. Doesn't seem right for a white guy like me to throw the challenge out there. But for him to do that, I think that's pretty amazing statement. Transformation comes from the dark. Last slide, now I'll wrap it up with this. Over and over again, as you read through the Gospels to his opponents, Jesus was a drunkard and a glutton. That's what they called him. Somebody who was a friend of tax collectors and sinners, always spending time with the wrong people in the wrong places. And, oh, by the way, his disciples are those that do not fast. Seems like those disciples were always looking for a party. They must have been more extroverts than introverts. I don't know. I just want to point out to you guys that in this story, this is the 8th meal that Jesus has in the Gospel of Luke. And this is the first day of the week. And it was 7 miles to where they were going. The 8th day is the dawning of the new day. And in this meal, where he takes the bread and he breaks it and he prays and he shares it, in the sacrament, the Eucharist, in the exchange, from moving from being both guest and host. Did you see that as I read it? He was guest and then he became host. That's your job. That's my job, to be both guest at others' invitation. When they invite us into their lives, we're the guest. And then we also must return the favor and be the host and invite others into our lives. Maybe that too is where Jesus shows up. Seems like it in the story. So in the narrative, Jesus is both wayfaring stranger, right? When you see stranger, Jesus in the story is wayfaring stranger. And Jesus is the risen, eternal God. That's the sight. To see him as both. Does that make sense? And the last thing I will say to you this morning, this ties back to the beginning of his ministry. Luke 4, in his hometown, gets the scroll, reads from Isaiah. And I'll read it to you because I don't want to screw it up. And I end with this, and I know I'm running. It's because DeMar played so long and beautifully, you clapped so long. Because we sing Enter In too many times. I've been asking, let's just do it once, LC. So then I can preach longer. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind. Recovery of sight to the blind. And their eyes were opened. And to let the oppressed go free. There's 2 words. Release and acceptance without vengeance. Why do I have acceptance without vengeance? Because the next line that Jesus does not read, who chooses not to read it, is to preach acceptance, the year of the Lord, and the vengeance of our God. Brothers and sisters, Jesus was not about vengeance. Jesus is about release, which is forgiveness, divine forgiveness, and the forgiveness of financial debt. That's what the term means. Not one, not the other, both. A holistic gospel is about divine forgiveness for a soul, a person, a human being, and about releasing from slavery,
the indebtedness that has come to a human being because of powers greater than themselves. That's what Jesus is about. I am a little concerned about brothers and sisters who are calling for vengeance right now. I really am. But I will end with this. Frederick Douglass, famous quote, I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. It's time for legs to join legs, to practice nonviolence and resurrection by entering into deep conversation, by listening as being guest and as being host. This is the model of Jesus Christ. This is the gospel. God bless you and thank you for coming this morning. Let's rise with a singing of a sweet, sweet spirit.